Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to Islam Between the Lines. My name is Farooq. This is the fourth and the last episode on the topic of taxation. In the third episode, we have discussed the general Islamic tax, which is a direct tax on taxable volume of goods and services payable by the owners themselves. The second particular tax levied in Islam is a wealth tax, which has no rates and no periodicity. It can be levied multiple times in the same period, and it can be 100% of the disposable wealth. If we recollect our second episode, we can recall that the verses about zakat were revealed earlier in Mecca, while the zakat was imposed only later in Medina. When the Prophet ﷺ himself was migrating, the last verse of the 73rd chapter was revealed, and it mentioned not only zakat but also the new thing of a good loan to Allah. Its mention besides zakat showed that it would be payable in addition to the zakat. Universally, loans are categorized as good or bad based on their chances of repayment. By that logic, a loan to Allah is certainly a good one because Allah won't default on its repayment. This loan would look like just another expenditure if Quran had not glorified it like nothing else. This verse 20 of chapter 73 assures that whatever good is sent before, it will be found as better and greater in recompense. During the first 2 years of immigration in Medina, 2 more verses were revealed in this regard. One was verse 245 of chapter 2, which said, "Who is the one who lends a good loan to Allah, so He will multiply it for him manifold." The other was verse 17 of chapter 64, which said, "If you lend a good loan to Allah, He will multiply it for you and will forgive you." About 2 or 3 years later, 2 more verses of chapter 57 were revealed on this point. Verse 11 said, "Who is the one who will lend a good loan to Allah, so He multiplies it for him?" And verse 18 added, "As for those who spend, both men and women, and lend a good loan to Allah, which will be multiplied for them will be a generous reward." This verse 18, while assuring proliferation of the good loan like the preceding verses, added that both men and women must lend it. Finally, somewhere in the 6th year of Hijrah or immigration, verse 12 of chapter 5 was revealed to convey that this is not any new thing prescribed for Muslims. It was prescribed for the earlier communities also. This verse read, "And indeed Allah made a covenant with the children of Israel, and we raised 12 chiefs among them. And Allah said, I am with you if you establish prayer and pay zakat, and believe in my apostles and support them, and lend to Allah a good loan." From Muslims, this loan to Allah was first sought theoretically when the Prophet was about to enter Medina, where a state would be set up sooner than later. With this allusion to a new tax, the Muslims were pre-informed that they shall have to bear the expenses of defending their new state to be. In other words, Islam prescribed that the Islamic State must collect from Muslims a defense tax to be utilized exclusively for protecting Islam in the Islamic State. Similarly, as a precious item is protected by protecting its container, like a laptop bag for the sake of laptop. That's what we get to know from the Prophet's application of this commandment. His companion Abu Masud Ansari narrated that whenever Apostle of Allah ordered us to give sadaqah, each of us would go to the market to work as porter and earn a mud. and now some of them have 100,000. Sahih Bukhari chapter 24, Hadith 20. Mud was a small measure of 775 ml or 544 grams approximately. It's notable that just half a kilo of food grain is earned by the poor companions, and all of it is taken by Allah's apostle as head of the state for his defense needs. It is neither 1/10 zakat on produce nor 1/40th zakat on wealth. And it is not annual either. Whenever Prophet, as head of the state, needed this defense tax, he demanded it from the Muslim subjects. Initially, the infant state of Medina was internally squeezed by the huge influx of immigrants, and externally, its enemies missed no chance to destroy or damage it. As a result, its defense demands were not only heavier, but also too many and too frequent. Another companion, Zaid bin Aslam, narrated that he heard Umar as saying, "We were ordered by Allah's apostle to give sadaqah, and coincidentally, I was wealthy at that time. I said that today I must beat Abu Bakr if I ever beat him. So I came with half of my wealth, and the Prophet asked me, 'What have you left for your family?' I said, 'As much.' Then came Abu Bakr with all that he had. The Prophet asked him as to what he had left for his family. He replied, 'I have left for them Allah and his apostle.' I said to myself, 'By Allah, I can never surpass him in anything.'" Jamia Tirmizi, chapter 49, Hadith number 71. We are not comparing Umar and Abu Bakr. For our topic, the important thing is that the Prophet has taken entire wealth of Abu Bakr and half of that of Umar. That much collection fits on no one scale of the two types of zakat. The Prophet of Allah has taken it only for the purposes of defense of war. In another instance, a Yemeni woman came to the Apostle of Allah along with her daughter, who was wearing 2 heavy gold bangles. The Prophet asked her if she had paid zakat on them. She said no. He said, "Would you like that Almighty Allah puts 2 bangles of fire on you on the day of resurrection?" And said, "Take them off." So she handed them over to him, saying, "These are for Allah and his apostle." Sunan An-Nasai, chapter 23, Hadith 45. Here the defense tax was taken from a female Muslim, that too from her in-use jewelry, which is otherwise not liable for zakat. Abdullah bin Umar used it to adorn his daughters and slave girls with gold jewelry, and he did not take any zakat from their jewelry. Muwatta Malik, chapter 17, Hadith number 11. But for battles, it was collected from women on Eid, and they also donated their jewelries. This readiness of the Prophet to take everything as sadaqah for defense was in sharp contrast to his reluctance to take undue sadaqah. A man once came to him with an egg much of gold and said, "O Apostle of Allah, I have got this from a mine, so take it. It is sadaqah. I have no more than this." The Prophet avoided him, but he came from his right side and said the same thing. The Prophet avoided him, but he came from his left side and said the same thing. The Prophet again avoided him, and he came from behind. Then the Apostle of Allah took it and threw it at him. If it had hit him, he would have been wounded or paralyzed. And the Apostle of Allah said, "One of you brings all that he has and says this is sadaqah. Then he sits down and begs before the people. Best sadaqah is that which leaves behind affluence." Sunan Abu Dawud, chapter 9, Hadith number 118. The Prophet has not fixed any rate or ceiling on the defense tax. not even as the head of the first Islamic state. This is left to the discretion of the governments which will be competent to levy this tax even at an exorbitant rate and also more than once in the same year. A question arises that what shall a government do if the maximum possible collection made by it still falls short of its immediate defense needs? The Prophet himself faced such situation within 2 weeks of the conquest of Mecca, when a big army had been mobilized in the valley of Hunain to attack Mecca and reverse the victory of Muslims. He assembled an army of 12,000 men, including 2,000 Tulakas, who had accepted Islam on the day of the conquest. For this imminent battle, the Prophet also borrowed from one person 30 or 40,000 dirham, which he repaid when he came back from the battle. Sunan Ibn Majah, chapter 15, hadith number 35. The Prophet also acquired coats of mail from a person who was not a Muslim then. He asked the Prophet, "Are you taking these forcibly?" The Prophet said, "No, it's a loan guaranteed." Sunan Abu Dawud, chapter 24, hadith number 147. Thus, Islam permits borrowing only and only for defense purposes. Going forward, collection of defense tax is not a wartime exercise really. It is better collected for defense preparedness during the times of peace. Quran says, "Muster against them all the force and cavalry that you can afford, to deter the enemies of Allah and your enemies, as also others besides them, whom you may not know but whom Allah does know. And whatever you spend in the way of Allah shall be rendered back to you, and no injustice will be done to you." Chapter 8, verse 60. Thus, the sustained peacetime defense preparedness is the objective of defense spending, aimed more at creating deterrence. Virtually, therefore, defense tax is a tax for peace, because while aggression disrupts the peace, deterrence secures it. Islam affords a chance to every Muslim, male and female, to participate in proactive jihad by sharing its cost. In all Quranic verses about jihad, the wealth of the Muslims is mentioned first, and their persons only next. Verse 95, chapter 8, verse 72, chapter 9, verses 20, 41, 44, 81, 88, chapter 49, verse 15, and chapter 61, verse 11. This indirect financial participation is also encouraged by these words of the Allah's Apostle. "Indeed, the one who equips a conqueror also conquers, and the one who looks after the property and dependence of a conqueror also conquers." Sahih Bukhari, chapter 56, hadith number 59. Sahih Muslim, chapter 33, hadith number 198. Jamia Tirmizi, chapter 22, hadith number 10. Sunan Abu Dawud, chapter 15, hadith number 33. Sunan Nasai, chapter 25, hadith number 96. That is how Islam has obligated every Muslim to fund the equipment and salary expenses of the forces. It also implies that this obligation is not cast on the military personnel themselves. However, this principle of public participation in the defense of state would be unfair without an appropriate differentiation. A state has two things to protect: its people and their properties. But unlike the ordinary people with modest material possessions, the millionaires and the billionaires have billions worth of assets to protect. It would be very unfair to ask everyone just to provide for a soldier each. The affluent must contribute more and ample for the defense. Allah's Apostle, on the occasion of the Battle of Tabuk, declared that whoever equips the army of distress will have paradise. Sahih Bukhari chapter 55, hadith number 41. That army consisted of 30,000 men, including 10,000 cavalries, and Usman equipped half of them. Sunan an-Nasai chapter 29, hadith number 60. After providing hundreds of laden camels, he went to the Prophet with 1,000 dinars and poured them into his lap. The Prophet was turning them over in his lap and said, Usman will not be harmed by whatever he does from today. Jamia Tirmizi chapter 49, hadith number 97. If modern business entities which hold billions and trillions in assets start equipping the respective armies, they certainly won't allow any military contractors to rake in the profits by commercializing the wars fought by the soldiers with their blood. The justification openly given to Muslims for defense spending equally applies to the non-Muslims as well, and Islam does not expect them to lag behind in their defense. In fact, the important non-Muslim countries today are militarily far ahead and are not in need of any advice on their defense equipment. Yet their defense system is financially gut-wrenching for their own citizens. This could be resolved by separating the defense tax to be levied and utilized exclusively for defense purposes. Back to the basics. Why is defense spending called a loan to Allah? Why does Allah need a loan in the first place? The answer is that Allah does not need any loan. He is only giving us the assurance of repayment of what we must spend for our security and defense. Unlike other zakat that is ultimately spent on ourselves, most of this expenditure is blocked in military hardware and ammunition. We cannot recover its cost from those who we destroy by its use. So Allah has taken upon Himself the repayment of this apparently an investment for loss, but virtually an expenditure for peace, and obviously a loan guaranteed by Allah is a good loan indeed. So we see that Islam exhorts Muslims to protect and defend their state at all costs. But in a state of Muslims, the protection equally avails the non-Muslims and their properties as well. But the defense tax is not levied on them, because non-Muslim citizens of an Islamic state are not asked to defend Islam. Their properties and persons are exempt from the military service. As the non-Muslims do not profess Islam, Islam does not ask them to protect it. That's how Islam extends its true regard and respect to the non-Islamic beliefs of the non-Muslims. They do not believe in Allah, so the non-Muslims are not asked to fight in His way against their conscience. Islam does not allow non-Muslims to fight their fellow non-Muslims with whom the Muslims might be at war just because those non-Muslims are living in an Islamic state. Nevertheless, by virtue of this exemption, the non-Muslim citizens of an Islamic state do not become a privileged class to be protected for free. They have to pay a small security tax in consideration for the security that the Muslim state would provide them against external threat or aggression. There is no special tax for internal security, which it is the duty of every state to provide to every person living in it. The separate tax levied on non-Muslim subjects of an Islamic state is called jizya and is sanctioned by the Quran in these words: until they pay the jizya by hand in a state of submission. Chapter 9, verse 29. Against jizya, security of non-Muslims becomes the responsibility or zimma of the Muslims. Hence the second name, zimmis or protectees for the non-Muslims. Pretty much like the defense tax for Muslims, jizya is purely a defense tax for non-Muslims. It is not any punishment by any means. In fact, it is much softer than defense tax payable by the Muslims, men and women. Jizya is an annual head tax levied only on free adult male citizens, not on the children, women, and the poor. Jamia Tirmizi, chapter 7, hadith number 7. Different rates of jizya can be fixed for the non-Muslims of lower, middle, and upper economic classes. The non-Muslims who pay, as well as those exempt from paying jizya, are all complete citizens with same rights to education, employment, commerce as Muslims themselves. Caliph Umar was once asked to give some advice, and he said, I advise you about the zimmis of Allah, as they are the zimmis of your Prophet, and livelihood of your dependents. Sahih Bukhari chapter 58, hadith 5. He protected the people of other religions by levying jizya on them, deducting no fifth from it, nor taking it as booty. His successors also followed this tradition. Sunan Abu Dawud chapter 20, hadith 34. Even when he was fatally injured, he did not forget to advise about them, saying, the promises with the protectees of Allah and the protectees of the Apostle must be kept for them, and fighting should be done for them, and they should not be burdened beyond their capability. Sahih Bukhari chapter 23, hadith number 146. The lives, property, honor, and all other civil rights of zimmis are inviolable. They can hold high posts in government, barring such of them as pertain to the defense and religious affairs of Muslims. They are governed by their own personal laws in the matters of marriage, divorce, inheritance, and disputes among themselves. They are free to consume pork and use alcohol as long as these are not made available to the Muslim population. The articulation of the Quranic verse on jizya is highly meaningful. Until they pay jizya by hand in a state of submission. Contrary to forcible collection, paying by hand implies a certain level of volition on the part of the payers. However, this political volition is not comparable to the free consent that underlies civil transactions. It's a mere political compromise to surrender and live as a peaceful citizen of an Islamic state. Essentially, therefore, jizya will be paid only by those non-Muslims who accept the sovereignty and protection of the Islamic State and agree to live with it. Thus, under this verse, no jizya can be taken from those non-Muslims who refuse to live in an Islamic state and fight back instead. On its part, the Islamic State will either let them go or it will fight to subdue them. If the state chooses to fight them out, it will fight at its own cost, because in their state of non-submission, they are not liable to pay any jizya. This is so dissimilar to the colonizers' approach, who tax the oppressed only to oppress them. Back to the loan to Allah again. A question arises as to why it has been mentioned with zakat and not in zakat. The reason appears to be that while it is leviable by the state pretty much like zakat, at the same time, unlike zakat, the payers have a choice not to pay, because a lender has always the right to lend or not to lend. This reserved right of refusal with the citizens is the democratic check on the rulers against waging a war not supported by the people. In this way, Islam legitimizes only those wars that are endorsed by the people practically with their financial support. Impliedly, it negates all those military adventures that are enacted by the few hawks burning out the general taxes against the wishes of the people, not to speak of the cannon fodder. Needless to say that unpopular wars are the biggest manipulated tragedies of the modern times. Now we come to the last one of the Islamic taxes, and that is the 40th part of the surplus wealth held for a full year. Its rate is very minimal, 2.5%, and it is favorably subjected to the expenses of a Muslim who is actually asked to spend according to his means. Quran chapter 65 verse 7. That means if a Muslim has had a huge income in any given year, but his expenses did not leave him with the minimum surplus, he shall not be liable to pay this zakat for that year. This zakat is clearly a wealth tax. While these two factors would seem to minimize the number of the potential payers of this zakat, the effective impact is also minimized by restricting the class of the people eligible to receive it to only the few. It looks like Islam envisages an overwhelming majority to be well off, whereupon only the 40th part of their surplus wealth should suffice for the social security of the remaining minority, impoverished from time to time for no common reasons. The hapless ones assisted with this zakat would not be any burden on the government. It deserves to be mentioned that by virtue of its being taken from the surplus wealth of the payers, this zakat is wrongly said to be useful in economic upliftment of the payees. The reason is that upliftment of a person requires an investment determined by his venture, but the amount of zakat that can be given to him is determined by the liability of the payer. This mismatch between a payee's need and the payer's liability will always remain there to fail the upliftment. This zakat is not for economic growth. It's only for supporting that growth against pitfalls. If it were meant for growth, then the substantial 97.5% becomes useless. The Apostle of Allah has prophesied that a time will come when a giver will not find any individual willing to receive the zakat. But he has not said that this zakat will become dispensable at that time. This raises the question that if the individuals will not be there to receive zakat, why then should it be paid or collected at all? One of the answers might be in the constant probability of the business failures, leading to occasional insolvencies and bankruptcies. In small cases, the lenders often absorb the shocks on their own. But in case of the big businesses, including banks, the brunt is always too big to bear, and the governments look for multiple reasons against the rescue. This zakat can be well used to bail out those sinking businesses. In that case, as only the affluent people shall be affordably paying a little portion of their surplus wealth to bail out a failing business, neither the government nor the public shall have any negative impact of the bailout. In fact, both of them will stand to benefit from such bailout without bearing the cost of it. Interestingly, this zakat cannot be used for everything and anything. It's payable only to the poor, the needy, those whose hearts are to be softened, the captives that can be freed, the debtors in distress, those in the path of Allah and the travelers. Other than these, only the people collecting and distributing it can be paid from it. Quran chapter 9 verse 60. And significantly, it cannot be paid to the non-Muslims because Islam would expect them to have a similar mechanism for themselves. But this is not to say that Muslims cannot help the non-Muslims at all. They can and they should. The only condition is that such assistance should be a general sadaqah and not from this zakat. The best feature of this zakat is that its financial decency does not at all drain out the giver or the government. Alhamdulillah, we are done with the topic of taxation. As usual, I conclude with my best wishes for the improvement in the social media, which afford free global platform to everyone without fear or favor. Thank you so much for watching. The next series, inshallah, will be about Islamic art of investment. Do watch if you will.